Hey everybody. So doing a third video for today over Labor Day weekend, and I guess you can call it action function weekend, which makes sense. Labor Day and everything. Um, these are the functions that you use to take action, to labor in the world. So this one's going to be a little bit, I don't know, I guess more lighthearted or sort of just um, sort of a whimsical view, I guess, of the INFP and the um, SE action function and what happens when it's in somebody's polar slot. So the other videos we've talked about what happens when the action function is, what you do with your action function that's in your main front stack. So, people either have SE or they have NE in their front stack. And those videos just sort of go into, I guess, excruciating detail, probably, on how the different action functions sort of manifest themselves through personality, um, depending on whether or not you have SE or NE in your front stack. So feel free to watch those for more background explanation on the action functions. But this one, I want to talk about, what happens when it's in the polar slot. Because, like I've said in a lot of videos, usually the best way to figure out how something works is to look at, what happens when it's not working or not sort of optimal, um, and sort of triangulate around there. And so I want to talk about Star Wars, and I want to talk about, in general, the INFP hero's journey. So Star Wars is, one of the classic examples of the hero's journey. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, you might want to watch a Google video or two about it. There's tons of them out there, but it's basically Joseph Campbell um, had this sort of theory or framework of how the hero's journey is this story that's been told over and over again through different cultures at different times. And it tends to follow a certain structure, right? You sort of start with the hero in point A, and then they move to point B and point C and point D and all around the circle. And then they come home and they've sort of transformed themselves into the hero. And I would argue that the hero in in the hero's journey and in all these, classic stories is all about getting somebody to take action, right? And just sort of historically through different cultures and different stories, the hero is, it's usually the man, but he could be the woman too, um, is the character that learns how to take action, and to, fight off the dragon or fight off the galactic empire or save the princess or do everything, do all of that. But it's all about taking action and learning how to take action. And they usually set up the main character, the person who ends up becoming the hero, as an, basically an INFP. Um, and because the reason that they'll use the INFP as sort of the character is because, number one, they have sort of this strong moral conviction, right? And so the story is about, this person has this moral conviction that, there's something wrong with the world that needs to be fixed. However, at the beginning of the story, they are SE polar, right? So they lack that action function, or at least it's, sort of buried away in their seventh slot, um, to actually take action and do something, right? Um, and so they usually call it, the reluctant hero, because they're, sort of just living their life doing what they're told, um, And then somebody comes along and says, hey, there's this adventure and we really need you. And you're the one, you're the chosen one. And the hero of the story usually starts off by saying, who, me? No, it couldn't possibly be me. Like, I can't do that. You're asking way too much of me. And they refuse to take action, right? And they might agree with, that something needs to be done, but they just don't accept the fact that they're the one to do it, right? And so the hero's journey sort of pops up in lots of different formats, like Star Wars, again, is the classic, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, where you just have this sort of average INFP kid that's just sort of, living life, and is relatively happy with where they're at, understands that there's probably, something wrong going on in the world, but hey, who am I, right? I don't have any power or any sort of ability to do anything about it. And so it's sort of this kind of SE polar thing, right? Where they just don't want to take action. So let's talk about Star Wars real quick and do a little bit of, film analysis here. And if you go back and you watch it, so the very first scene where you're introduced to Luke, it's really funny. They do a good job of setting this up. And by the way, one quick thing, George Lucas and Joseph Campbell were both very into Carl Jung and archetypes, and Joseph Campbell's whole theory of the hero's journey is based in large part on a lot of Carl Jung's writings and ideas that he put out there. And a lot of it has to do with just that there's this archetype of the hero buried somewhere in our collective unconscious. So it's not, totally insane to try to be making these ties or these, these links between, George Lucas writing Star Wars. I mean, he definitely was basing it off of the hero's journey. And Joseph Campbell sort of coming up with the hero's journey and tying this all to Jungian cognitive functions. I'm not going completely bonkers here. So going back to Star Wars, they start off with the opening scene, and it's set up really, like it really nails it, where the very first time you see Luke, and the very first conversation he has, his uncle is telling him something to do. His uncle is telling him, like, go pick out a robot that the Jawas brought, right? And so he's following his uncle's order, but right when he starts to go do that, his aunt yells from off screen, Luke, Luke. And so he has to run. And now his aunt is telling him, make sure your uncle gets a blah, 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 right? A droid that can do X, Y, and Z. And so now, like, immediately you have this picture of Luke, this kind of teenage kid, that his life is basically consisting of people just telling him what to do, right? He's got what I'd probably argue an ESTJ uncle ordering him around, and probably an ESFJ aunt ordering him around and telling him, do this, right? And so then they go and they're haggling with the Jawas, and they pick out a robot or two. And then his uncle, tells Luke, I need you to go, fix them up or get them ready or whatever. And you hear the classic line with Luke pouting, oh, I wanted to go to Takashi Station to pick up some power converters. And his uncle's like, oh, you could go hang out with your friends, later on your own time, but I need you to do this, right? So again, they're painting this picture of this poor kid who's just being told what to do all the time, right? You can also compare that to like Harry Potter with like his crazy aunt and uncle that he lived with, and they were constantly telling him what to do. And so they really had, so these heroes sort of start off with just sort of no SE, right? That like they're not exerting their will into the world. Or at least, if they try to, they're very quickly shot down and they're told, to do something else. So then you flash forward and he meets Obi-Wan Kenobi. And Obi-Wan Kenobi, they get the message from Princess Leia, and you can tell, like, Kenobi, like, he knows that this is Luke Skywalker, and he's probably going to be pretty good with the Force, given who his father is. No spoilers. And um, and he even sort of tests him a little, and he gives him the lightsaber, and he just kind of wants to see what Luke's going to do with it. Of course, Luke turns it on, and he's swinging it around, and you can kind of tell, like, Obi-Wan Kenobi's like, oh, this, he's actually kind of taking action. He's actually doing something, and so maybe there is something in this kid. And then, he brings up, well, I need you to go with me to Alderaan or wherever they're going, to go talk to Princess Leia, because I'm too old and I need somebody. And of course, he sees it in Luke that, he should probably be trained and all that. And he's probably the last hope, the chosen one, whatever you want to call it. But immediately Luke shuts it down and says, no, I can't do it. Who am I? Like, I'm not a soldier or a pilot or anything like that. You're asking too much of me. And of course, Ben's reaction is, that's your uncle talking, right? Like, you are listening to the ESTJ's NE explanation of things and not your own NE explanation of things. And you sort of need to dig deep inside. So things progress. Eventually Luke just sort of finds himself sort of tagging along on this mission, and then the story just ends up being, can we get Luke to actually overcome the voice of his uncle or whatever telling him not to do things, and actually take action and be a man of action. And again, that's what the classic hero story is taking a kid or somebody who lacks action, lacks SE, lacks sort of the will to impose their will on the outside. I'm trying to think of ways of explaining it. But to basically take action, right? And so he sort of stumbles along the way, and there's sort of the classic scene where they're they're on the Death Star or whatever, and they get they jump into the trash compactor, right? And the trash compactor starts to close in on them, and if Luke was like a full-blown hero, a man of action, he would just, sort of do the Force and get it to stop. But instead, he has to rely on somebody else to do the work for him, right? He has to, like, get R2-D2 or whatever to shut down the system. So he's not quite there yet, right? Like, he's done a few things. He's, done the little swing across the bridge and other things like that, but he's not quite there, right? And so then he has to go train with Yoda, and of course it's it's the classic line, do or not do, there is no try, right? Like, either take action or don't take action. There's no in between. And so, are you going to be a man of action, or are you not? Or are you just going to sit there and pout about how you're incapable of doing it or whatever? And then more stuff happens along the way. And then you finally get to the climax of the entire movie, which is the whole point of at least the first Star Wars. And that is literally getting Luke to pull the trigger when he's in his little, starfighter, his little spaceship. What is it? Y fighter or something? I don't know. Anyways, I forgot what all the planes are called. But anyway, so he's literally in his little spaceship, and the entire movie rests on him pulling the trigger, taking action at the right time, right? And shooting his little laser into, the air duct or whatever it was on the space station and blowing it up, right? Because that was like the weak spot. And the entire galaxy and the fate of humanity rested on this one kid literally pulling the trigger and taking action. And then, of course, he saves the world, and now he's the hero, and he can go back home or wherever he's going as the hero. And normally, that's sort of where the saga would end, right? The hero returns home, but of course, because it's Star Wars, they had to sort of make it into a longer story. But they basically started with an INFP and made him into, I don't know, an ESTP or an ISTP or something, some sort of hero that has no problem actually taking action on the world. And so then you compare that to, like, his sort of ultimate height when he's in Return of the Jedi, and he gets faced with sort of a similar situation where he's thrown into a pit and this monster's after him, right? But it's kind of like the trash compactor when he was in a pit there, but he didn't know what to do. Well, here, now he's in the pit and he totally knows what to do, and he uses the force and he kills the monster and everything's fine. And so it's shown you this like progression of, not being able to take action to be able to take action. And then ultimately at the very end, spoilers, of course, he, is being told, or, like, kill the emperor, right? Like, take action, be a man of action, and kill the emperor, to sort of fulfill your overall duty or whatever. Or is it to kill Darth Vader? It's to kill one of them, right? But he's being told, like, yeah, kill Darth Vader. And and then, like, in a weird sense of irony, he doesn't take action, right? He, lets his lightsaber down and he says, I am not going to kill anybody. That's just not right. And it doesn't fit with my FI morals, right? And so now you've sort of gone full circle and then full circle again, where by not taking action, he is doing the right thing, right? And then Darth Vader has to get up and throw the Emperor over the railing and presumably kill him, until, much later. Okay, so that is the hero's story. That's the hero's journey. It's all about exerting your will. And, like I've said before, socionics, when they talk about SE, extroverted sensing, they literally call it using force, right? And in Star Wars, it's all about using the force, taking action, making things happen in the world. And that is, again, sort of just the moral, or the moral story, or the moral point of these heroes' journeys. And it's all about transcending, right? Like starting at point A and transcending and sort of overcoming your sort of INFP polar weakness and becoming a man of action. And you see it in Harry Potter, you see it in, Lord of the Rings. Again, you start off with Frodo. He's totally chilling, enjoying himself in, the Shire, doesn't really have much of a care in the world. And now all of a sudden, Gandalf comes along and says, hey, we need you for whatever reason. I guess it's because he had the ring or whatever. I don't know. But we need you, Frodo, because you're the chosen one for some reason to do that. And Frodo's like, I can't do this. I don't have the ability. I'm not like a big knight, that can defeat an army or anything like that. And it just becomes this whole story of him learning how to take action and learning to be confident and, in the action that he's taking. And, and again, the action is relatively simple. Like, he just has to take a ring, throw it into a volcano, and you're done, but of course the steps along the way are excruciatingly, difficult, become more and more difficult, and it becomes harder and harder for him to take the action. And then of course when he actually gets close to having to throw the ring in, the ring's power takes over him and, gets him to sort of not take action, right? But so you can see why it's such an important thing in literature, just, being a hero is about taking action. And to me, it helps explain what SE is all about, right? Um, it's not just knowing how to do it, it's not knowing what to do, it's having the ability to actually do it, right? Now, there is some learning along the way, like learning the force and learning the tricks and everything. But the idea is it was always sort of inside you, and you're just sort of bringing it out and learning how to manifest it in the world. Okay. Now you can compare that to the flip side of the story, and that's, Darth Vader, Anakin Skywalker, and, he's probably more of an ESTP where he's definitely a man of action, but, it ends up being a tragedy for him where by taking action, he ends up screwing everything up. Um, and I would argue he had like FI polar, and that's why he like couldn't handle his feelings, right? Like like any other personality type would be able to handle those FI feelings, but they were just too much for him, right? And because he was a person of action, he acted on these feelings, in a way that wasn't healthy, right? Um, and so, and then his full circle comes around by, he ends up being the one to actually take action at the very end of A New Hope by picking up the Emperor and throwing him over the balcony, right? So he was able to fulfill his journey by basically, you know, being a man of action, but having too much, right? Like too much hubris. And so that's sort of the balance in classical literature of, you either start with somebody who has a difficult time taking action and being a man of action or a woman of action. Sorry, not trying to exclude anybody here. Um, and then you learn along the way to be a person of action and to sort of get over that hump, that polar hump, right? Um, or versus somebody who starts off being a person of action and then they end up becoming a tragic figure because they have too much hubris, right? They fly too close to the sun or whatever, and it's because of their, you know ability to take action and impose their will on the world that they end up sort of tragically making things worse, right? So, the Greeks would always say nothing in excess, right? You need a balance, right? You need to not be, too far on the not taking action end of the spectrum and not too far up on the taking action end of the spectrum, and try to find some nice balance in the middle. And of course, that's balance in the force. And that's what Star Wars is all about. Now, of course, they totally screwed up Luke Skywalker in the last three um, installments, right? In the last three movies, because they changed him into like a grumpy old ESTJ, right? It was like, this is pointless. I'm not going to do this anymore. And that's why it didn't resonate with people, and why like the diehard Star Wars fans that grew up, with Luke turning from a man of inaction to a man of action, but having, a good balance, where he knew when to turn it off, right? At the end of Return of the Jedi, he knew how to turn off the, imposing his will by, turning off his lightsaber and saying, "I'm not going to kill Darth Vader or the Emperor," whoever it was, um, and and showed that balance, right? And then he turns into this old crusty ESTJ that is like, it's got nothing to do with being a man of action or, having balance between action and inaction. It's just like, I'm crusty ESTJ that just hates the world or whatever. Um, and that's why it didn't resonate with people. That's why people got so pissed, because you took our archetype that we grew up with, that we sort of learned our lesson about what it means to be a person or a man of action, and you turn him into this like total crusty ESTJ. It's like, oh well, if you take action, everything's gonna suck. And so there's no point in it, blah 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 blah. And it just, it just broke everybody's heart. Even Mark Hamill just hated it, right? He just like, this is not Luke. But for whatever reason, they wanted to change the story. And that's why, a lot of modern stories just don't resonate, with kids, I don't think, as much, because they're not relying on these old, tried and true archetype stories. They're kind of making up their own story, right? I'm not going to get into the politics of it all, but there is something to be said about teaching kids through stories, the power of transformation, right? Going from somebody who doesn't take action to somebody who does take action, but not too much, who knows how to turn it off, and keep some balance, right? And that's the story of Luke Skywalker. And then on the flip side, the story of Darth Vader and Anakin Skywalker being, having too much action, having too much hubris, being too much of a person of action, and not knowing when to, tone it down a little. But then ultimately at the end takes the right action and sort of saves the day, until 20 years later when they decide to bring the Emperor back for some reason and completely destroy the whole point of, the first 3 movies, right? Or the first 6 movies. Okay, so that, I guess, sort of a rough description of SE, what it means to have polar SE and to overcome it. Now, of course, all you INFPs and INTPs out there with your polar SE, I certainly hope, you can learn the ways of the force and learn to, be people of action, and to transcend that. And of course, all the other stories are about having, other types of polar functions, right? And we can talk about other stories on another video. And the other thing I would say is, INFPs will also be used as tragic figures themselves. So instead of heroes, they become tragic figures. And it's when they never learn to take action. And that's the classic Hamlet, right? So Hamlet is the classic tragic character where there's actually the term, the dithering Hamlet, or the dithering Dane. And dithering means just the inability to actually just make a decision and to take action. And you have all these horrible catastrophes, that happen throughout Hamlet, because Hamlet refuses to take action and make a decision. There's a lot of different theories out there of why, some might say, he just didn't have, he was SE polar, he was an INFP, and he just never learned, he didn't have the Obi-Wan Kenobi or the Yoda to teach him how to take action. But he was put into this position where, everything sort of relied on him to take action, but he never learned it, right? Or other people make the theory that, yeah, he knew what he had to do and he could have done it, but he just kind of knew that it was pointless, right? Kind of this like, Nietzsche kind of nihilism, right? Where, what's the point? of doing, to be or not to be. What's the point, right? Like, and so instead of actually doing something, he would engage his extroverted intuition and just talk about it for 20 minutes in some sort of monologue. Um, and then ultimately not do anything, and then his entire kingdom and everybody around him dies, right? Because he couldn't take action, and he couldn't be a man of action, so to speak. Um, so so literature will work both ways, right? And it's all about, do you want the hero to actually learn and become a hero and become a man of action, or do you want them to just sort of wither on the vine and show, like, here's all the catastrophe and here's all the horrible things that'll happen if they don't take action? Of course, modern movies, Hollywood storytelling, we like the act, the heroes that decide to take action, the Frodos, the Harry Potters, the Luke Skywalkers. Those are the people we cheer for. We don't want to watch somebody just sort of withering on the vine because they refuse to take action. We don't mind the tragedies. I don't think of, like, the ESTPs or the hubris, right, where they they take too much action. They think they're too good, and that ends up being their downfall. Somebody else might be sort of like a Walter White character, where it's not so much about SE, and it's really more about too much NE, probably. Like, he just thought he was too smart, right? And that ends up being his ultimate downfall, is because he's just so smart. And he thinks he can, get himself out of any situation, because along the way he was, until it was just out of hand. Anywho, okay. So I think that's enough on that. If you've got any thoughts, certainly let me know. But it's just something fun to think about. And when you're thinking about cognitive functions and SE and polar, always think about Luke Skywalker and the lessons that Luke Skywalker taught us, going from SE polar to a fully functioning, highly functioning SE, but he never lost that introverted feeling, right? And so at the end of the day, he was able to balance it all out. And I guess, that's the point of the hero's journey. All right. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you later.